Everybody, I am here with Elizabeth, aka Liza Goitein, who is the Senior Director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. And Liza, you have quite a bit of experience in dealing with presidential authority and power. And I know you clerked for Judge Michael Daley Hawkins on the U.S. Court of Appeals. You've worked with Senator Russ Feingold, who was chair of the Constitution Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So this is your area of expertise. So thank you for talking with us. And I guess the first question I want to get to right away is, according to the latest news reports, about 500 Marines are now being deployed to the Los Angeles area. It's something that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth floated over the weekend. Talk about this development and its significance.
Yeah, I mean, this is really escalating things, and really deploying the National Guard and federalizing them was already escalating a difficult situation. This is really just going to put the whole thing on steroids. It is extremely rare for a president to deploy the active duty armed forces inside the United States for this kind of a civilian function in terms of quelling unrest. That kind of situation. And in general, right, quelling unrest is a responsibility under our Constitution of state and local law enforcement. Even when protests do have some violence, some vandalism, it is state and local authorities who handle that in all but the most extreme instances, by law and by tradition.
That is the so-called Posse Comitatus. Is that what they call
Yeah,
it? Which made
exactly.
the division
Exactly.
between police officers and the military. And it's
Right.
in fact against the law for the military to take on law enforcement duties, correct?
That's correct. Most of the time it is. That is the general rule that's established by the Posse Comitatus Act, and it draws that line
Let's
between
talk. Yeah.
the nation's military and our police officers. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about how this escalates. I mean, what do you see as the difference between having the National Guard there versus active duty military troops?
Yeah, well, the first question I have is what is the legal authority? Because the legal authority for deploying the National Guard that Trump relied on was not the usual authority, that the authority that presidents have used consistently in these civil unrest situations. Of course, this has been very rare in US history. It's only happened 30 times, but in those instances, the president has invoked the Insurrection Act. That's not what President Trump did. He is relying on an obscure legal authority that has not ever been used in the way he's using it. However, that legal authority only allows the president to federalize the National Guard. It does not allow the president to deploy active duty armed forces. So that's my first question, is what is the legal authority he's relying on? If he hasn't invoked the Insurrection Act, if he's not planning to, he needs to point to something else
But
for what he's
Liza, I
doing
wanted to
this.
mention that he recently, I think within the hour, called the protesters insurrectionists. So I guess the question is
Right.
he getting ready to invoke that act by doing so?
Yeah. I mean, he has been using that term for a while, off and on. He sort of goes back and forth. Um, and he's also used the term rebellion. The word rebellion is in the statute that he did invoke. It's also in the Insurrection Act. So I don't know if we can take that as a clue. I don't know if we can read the tea leaves here, or if that's just rhetoric that he's using. But my understanding is that this battalion of the Marines has been mobilized and it's on its way to Los Angeles. Under the Insurrection Act, the president has to issue a proclamation and to order the protesters to disperse, essentially to give them a chance to you know to de-escalate the situation on their own before troops are deployed. That hasn't happened. So if he is relying on the Insurrection Act, he has violated some of the procedures that need to be followed.
What is the obscure act or the obscure rationale you mentioned that allowed him to even deploy or federalize, which basically means he's using state National Guard troops in a federal capacity, right?
Yeah, right. So this is a provision in Title 10. It's 10 USC 124406. Obviously, it's not something that most people have heard of. And it allows the president to federalize the National Guard where there's a rebellion or a threat of a rebellion, where there's an invasion or threat of an invasion by a foreign nation, or where the president needs to execute the law and cannot execute the law using sort of regular forces. Um, but, and so there's some overlap between what it covers and what the Insurrection Act covers. Um, but it has always been a little bit of a puzzle how that law interacts with the Insurrection Act. And what presidents have sort of landed on and what the conduct has been over the last few decades is that presidents will invoke both together. So the president will invoke the Insurrection Act and 12406. 12406 is treated as the authority that allows the president to transfer control from the State National Guard to the president. So it is sort of the technical call-up authority. And then he uses that to then deploy the National Guard under the Insurrection Act. It's very complicated. The bottom line is that 12406 has not been treated or used as a standalone authority. It's been used as a complement to the Insurrection Act. So this is sort of new legal territory to have a president trying to rely on it without an Insurrection Act invocation.
And so he's arguing in the Insurrection Act that the protesters or the people he's arresting or trying to deport are the insurrectionists. Who are the insurrectionists in this?
Yeah. So actually under the Insurrection Act, there doesn't have to be an insurrection. It's actually much broader than that. I know it's titled the Insurrection Act, but there are other criteria that that can trigger the use of the Insurrection Act, including obstructions of federal law, for instance. But again, he hasn't relied on the Insurrection Act. He's relied on this other authority. And for that authority, the only way he can sort of fit in here, or the way he has, I think, tried to fit in here, is through this term rebellion. Now, I don't know that for sure because, you know, we'll find out, I think, as this lawsuit goes forward, what exactly the president is relying on. There are also indications that he might be relying on a claim of inherent constitutional authority to protect federal property and functions. That's another one.
Is that sort of that under the rubric of the unitary executive, whatever that is?
It's a little bit different. It is, and this is not just President Trump. So the executive branch has actually taken this position for a long time, for several decades. It's basically a legal theory that there is an inherent, meaning it's not explicit, it's not actually written anywhere in the Constitution, but that the president, sort of by virtue of the duty to execute the law, has inherent power to deploy troops to protect federal property and federal functions, and that he can do this somehow without triggering the Posse Comitatus Act, even if the federal troops are engaged in activities that would otherwise, look like law enforcement. So this is not, there's not a Supreme Court decision out there saying, the Posse Comitatus Act goes away when the president deploys troops to protect federal property and they can engage in any kind of law enforcement activity. This is an executive branch theory that has not been fully tested in the courts.
So what do you see happening? Is there any legal recourse to get the National Guard and the Marines out of there? Because it does seem as if they are going to simply escalate the situation, depending on the so-called rules of engagement that they're handed, right?
Right. And we don't know what those look like. Apparently, they're still being finalized as they're on their way to Los Angeles. I don't know how the troops are supposed to have been familiarized with the rules of engagement if they're on the scene before they've even been finalized. That's a little bit worrisome. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of concern here, a lot of reason for concern that this is going to escalate the situation. Before the Guard deployment, at the point that they were deployed, things had really settled down. And the LAPD was saying, we've got this under control, and it certainly looked that way. And Governor Newsom was saying, if you deploy the National Guard over the objections of the city of Los Angeles, over the objections of the governor of the state, and you sort of turn them on these protesters in this community, it is going to escalate matters. It is going to be inflammatory. And that certainly seems to have happened, because as soon as the Guard was deployed, we saw things turn around again and start to go south. And I think to escalate it even further through the deployment of active duty armed forces, that I think there's a lot of reason for concern here that things are going to become even more just, it's going to
Incendiary.
incendiary. That's the word I was looking for. Yep.
Do you think that the administration somehow wants that?
I mean, there's a version of this where the active duty troops are deployed, things get more incendiary, and then Trump uses that as a basis to invoke the Insurrection Act, which basically means that deployment of the military itself caused a crisis that then becomes the justification for deploying the military. And we're in this vicious cycle. Of course, I hope that doesn't happen, but this is one of the reasons why presidents cannot just freely use the military as a domestic police force. It's one of the reasons why we have the Posse Comitatus Act. Citizens in a free democracy do not want to see the military coming into their streets in armored vehicles and patrolling the streets. And soldiers didn't join the army for this. They joined the army to protect Americans against hostile foreign nations and foreign powers, right? Not to police American citizens. So this is really, I don't know who wants this other than President Trump and Secretary Hegseth. It's really a terrible situation.
And tell us what your biggest concerns are about what is unfolding, just from a legal perspective.
Right.
The work you do.
Right. So the Posse Comitatus Act serves a critical purpose, right? It's not just some kind of arcane legal philosophy. It is a core principle. It dates back centuries, all the way to the Magna Carta, that is there as a protection against tyranny, as a protection for individual liberties. Because when a president can turn an army against the citizens of a country, and use it domestically inside the borders. That is one of the quickest paths, or at least indicators that the individual freedoms are gone and democracy is completely can be undermined. And that's why we have this rule, right? So that's a legal concern, but it's a very practical concern as well. If we set this precedent, if the courts permit it, if this becomes, and I should mention, President Trump's memorandum that in the beginning that started this by federalizing and deploying the National Guard doesn't mention Los Angeles. It authorizes the deployment of federalized National Guard and active duty armed forces anywhere in the country where protests against ICE activity are occurring, or even where they're just likely to occur. So this is, and Trump himself said on Sunday, we're going to have deploy troops everywhere. So we're talking about a potential nationwide deployment of the military to effectively police protests. That's not supposed to happen in the United States. That happens in autocracies. That happens in authoritarian nations. That is not supposed to happen here. And that is how that could play out even outside of Los Angeles is really, really alarming. It's really dangerous. So, I mean, that's one of my concerns. I'm also concerned just about the practicalities on the ground. You mentioned the rules of engagement. The military isn't trained to act as police officers, right? They are trained to fight. They are trained to destroy an enemy. They don't have this extensive training. Most of them have no training, certainly in the active duty armed forces, in how to handle and de-escalate civil unrest situation in a manner that respects the constitutional rights of Americans, right? This is just not, it is not their job. It is not their mission. It is not their training. And that makes this situation even more combustible and unsafe.
Liza Goitein, thank you so much for talking with us about this. Let's stay in touch as things hopefully don't escalate, but as things advance in this very, really frightening situation.
Yeah, thank you, Katie.